Hi, everyone. Welcome to Listening, Trusting, a conversation on media, justice, and the Asian American community. Thank you to the University of Washington Communication Leadership Graduate Program, and in partnership with the Department of Communication and the Center for Journalism, Media, and Democracy for making this panel possible. So I especially want to thank our panelists, Erin, Sophia, Jonathan, and Julia for agreeing to participate in the panel, and more crucially, to engage with the larger community in this conversation that touches, maybe uncomfortably at times, on issues of power, race, and justice. So my plan is to have you all introduce yourselves, but first so my plan is to have you all introduce yourselves. Then I have a couple questions to ask, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. So for the audience out there, you can put your questions either in the Q&A. So if you go to the bottom of your screen and click on Q&A, you can write questions in there, or you could just put them in the chat if you prefer. Either way, the questions will be visible to both us as the panelists and the rest of the audience. All right, so before we launch into the panel, I want to take a couple minutes to tell you about the genesis of the panel to give you some context for our conversation. When I first heard about the idea, it was in a conversation with Matt Chan and Mimi Gan, who were concerned by what they saw as a tension between Asian American activists and journalists, especially in mainstream publications in Seattle. One example they gave was at a rally where the organizers asked journalists to leave. And Matt had also noticed that some of the activists he worked with were equally hesitant to speak with journalists. And so we wanted to open up the space to talk about what's going on, why this might be happening, and what, if anything, we might do to address these tensions. Oh, hi, Sharon. Thanks for joining us. And so I think we have our full panel now. So I guess I'll go person by person. If you could introduce yourself, tell us any affiliations you think are relevant, and how you came to be on this panel. So Julia, can we start with you?
Hi, yeah, my name is Julia Furukawa. I am a journalist I'm with KNKX Public Radio right now, but in about 3 days, I will be moving to New Hampshire to start a job producing All Things Considered for New Hampshire Public Radio. I am making my transition to radio from print. I did print all through college, and then most recently I finished up as an assistant managing editor for the Paris News, which is not in Paris, it's in Paris, Texas. So not quite as glamorous, but very fun. And I was born and raised here in Seattle. I went to Garfield High School, went to Western Washington University, where I went through the journalism program there. I'm a member of AAJA, and I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. Sophia?
Hi everyone, my name's Sophia Knauf. I'm the digital editor at Crosscut right now. Before this, I worked at the Evergrey as a storytelling producer and at The Stranger as a reporter. And I like to joke that I've kind of interned my way all around Seattle media, excluding TV and radio. I'm a graduate of the UW-COM undergrad program. So I graduated in 2013, so I know it's a very different program than what it looks like today. Aside from that, I've been reporting in Seattle, I'd say actively since about 2013. So I've kind of worked from Puget Sound Business Journal, I've written for Seattle Met, and I've written for Grist and a couple of other publications. Most of my career has been in print writing. I've also assisted on some video projects, but words have always been my first love. So thank you for having me.
Erin?
Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Shugaki. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm a public artist and activist, born and raised here in Seattle, but spent a lot of time on the East Coast, and I'm happy to be back in the community, kind of working out of the CID as my home base for the movement. And I'm affiliated with the Minidoka Pilgrimage and Sudo for Solidarity and SCIPTA and the Wing Luke and a bunch of other Asian American organizations. Glad to be here.
Jonathan?
My name's Jonathan Cho. I'm a reporter for Como News. It's the ABC affiliate in Seattle. And actually, I'm from Boston, Julia, so I know New Hampshire very well, and I know New England. And I've been in Seattle now for the past year. I moved during the middle of the pandemic. I drove cross country, so that was a heck of an experience. But I've really had a crash course now in Seattle news, and it's quite different than what I'm used to covering on the East Coast. So I've been in the middle of covering riots, protests, in the middle of homeless encampments, and apparently I've pissed off a lot of people in the activist community as well, sort of guilt by association. For those of you who may not know, Como is owned by Sinclair Broadcast Group, and they have this reputation, fair or unfair, as being more right-leaning. And because of that, what I've experienced in Seattle, unfortunately as well from the Asian American community, some that is, especially though in the media, is instead of getting to know me and trying to ask me about where I'm coming from and the stories I care about, they've already, again, thrown the baby out with the bathwater and lumped me into one category. So that's the narrative and the challenge that I'm facing. And I'm hoping through this panel to not only give you a sense of where I'm coming from and how I cover news, but at the same time, I want a better understanding of what you guys are all trying to do as well. And on a side note, I'm part of the Asian American Journalists Association as well. I've actually one of the founding members of the recently formed Broadcast Advisory Council. And part of that initiative recently is to really highlight the Asian American faces on television. But when it comes to Asian men, the lack thereof. So I really take pride. And again, the fact that I'm the only Asian male broadcaster on this panel is very telling, because according to AAJA, there's basically a 4-to-1 ratio of Asian females to men on air. And there are a variety of reasons. I'd love to get into that today if we have more time. But that's it for me.
And Sharon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sharon Ho Chang, and I'm an author, photographer, and activist, transitioned into a managing editing role at the South Seattle Emerald over this last year. But prior to that was a writer and photographer for them since 2016. So my rep to community journalism has been a little unconventional, I guess you would say, in that I was an author, photographer, and activist first, and still am, was on the ground a lot. And then, you know, started working in community journalism to try to help get those stories out, and then still have a lot of great connections with community and with activists, and have lived in Seattle for 21 years now. I don't even know where the time goes. My husband is born and bred Seattle Northwest, and my son too. So we have deeper and deeper roots here all the time.
All right, and I'm Leilani Nishime. I'm a professor at the University of Washington. I use she, her pronouns. And I also work with the Seattle Asian American Film Festival. So I have a little bit of my world is out there in Seattle as well. All right, so I'm going to start with a couple questions that I have prepared, and I just want to remind you all again that if there's questions that you'd like to ask, that you can put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom, or you can put them in the chat. All right, so one of the first questions I wanted to ask was, why do you think that activists sometimes decide not to communicate with the media? And I guess can we start with Julia, and then whoever wants to join in.
I think, you know, Jonathan's introduction got me thinking about this. There's a lot that goes with reputation and with past experiences with media, whether those are, you know, perceived things, or whether that is something that the news outlet may have messed up on. But something I encountered in college when I was running my newspaper was that there were a lot of organizations on campus run by students of color that did not want to talk to our school newspaper. And that was because the coverage in the past had been unfair, it had been inaccurate, had been inauthentic, it had not told the whole story. And so that relationship, before I even reached out, that relationship was already severed. And I think that creates a trauma for folks where their story has not been told in the way that it truly is, or in the way that things happen to them. And it is easier and it's safer for them to say, you know what, I'm just not going to engage right now because I'd rather have my truth exist with me and not have a bunch of people read it in a way that this reporter might spin it. That's difficult because at least I can say for myself, and I think for the vast majority of journalists, we want to do our very best and we want to tell things as accurately, authentically, fairly as possible. But I understand where a lot of activists come from when they say that, you know, you haven't done us justice in the past and I don't trust you to do it again. So it's not worth my time. It's not worth my emotional energy. And it's not worth me putting all of the work I'm doing on the line for you to go and maybe screw it up. So that's kind of what I've seen in my short journalism career so far.
I just, I had this experience at Bellevue College, right, where I was, my work was whitewashed and erased. And I had a very positive experience with the Seattle Times, who, was the outlet that picked that story up first. But because I had that experience, then when Day of Remembrance, which recalls the date that Japanese Americans, were going to be forcibly removed due to Executive Order 9266. We, that's like our sacred holiday every February. So this year I was contacted by someone at Cairo, and I was on an artist residency, but he got my phone number somehow and texted me and was sort of haranguing me to do an interview with him. And because I feel a responsibility to tell, my community story, like that's the core of my work, I took this interview with him and, talked about this traumatic experience. And then, a few weeks later, I was like, I wonder if that's what happened to that story. I did a little searching, didn't find it. And then I texted him and he was like, oh yeah, no, sorry, it didn't, I had to drop it. So this sort of disregard for the content of these stories, particularly emotional ones, I just was really off put by that. And I don't proclaim to know how sort of the TV news cycle works and exactly what he meant by it didn't fit in or whatever, but it really left a bad taste in my mouth, I'll say.
I wanted to add, I'm relating to what you're saying, Erin, because I've actually been on both sides. So because I'm an author and I've published 2 books and I'm a photographer, I have been interviewed by media and been in stories. And then now I'm also managing editor and I'm assigning stories and working with writers. And I have also been misrepresented multiple times to the point that I don't accept many interviews anymore. And I do agree with you, Julia, that there's a lot of good intention out there, but I do think that journalism historically has served white folks and the white dominant narrative and the status quo. And so the training is really like, the training and the whole culture of journalism tends to lean that way. And so I have encountered so many journalists who just don't have an analysis and they don't understand, like when you do an interview with a person of color, that you're asking a lot from them. And if you just drop the story, it's like, we could be using that energy in a lot of other places. I've had stories drop too. And it's like, why did I spend 2 hours talking with you when you didn't care? And so those kind of experiences, I think there's a training issue with journalists. And I do think there are journalists who don't actually care in some ways as well. So I think there's just like a whole shift that needs to happen.
I can go on and on about this topic, but just to add to kind of the flow right now, yeah, I'm really sorry, Erin, that happened. Wasn't Como, wasn't me. So give us a chance. I'd love to tell your story. However, I'll just quickly add a couple points. Number one, I think most newsrooms are just not equipped to tell stories about communities of color. Because it's just not a priority. In television news, unfortunately, if it bleeds, it leads. So it's all about breaking news. It's about, being sensational. We rarely get into the context and analysis and really what it means for the community piece. And that's our bad. And I'm just using broad brush strokes here, but In fairness, let me also throw out that unfortunately, there are also lots of Asian American journalists who are completely out of touch with the Asian American narrative and experience. So don't just assume because you're talking to an Asian person, that Asian person understands your experience. And of course, this applies to Blacks, Hispanics, blah, 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 everyone else along the line. I've had I've had white people who understood more about the Asian experience than Asian American friends of mine. So there are a whole bunch of, you know, complexities to this. But yeah, to add to your point, Julia, yeah, hell yeah, we burned a lot of people in the activist community as well. But, you know, on the flip side of that, let me just let all the activists know, we're also not just here to be your mouthpiece, right? We have to tell the story fairly and accurately. And in my experience, at least with my reporting, I always try to get both sides. But sometimes people will say, well, you didn't give me enough time. Or again, unfortunately, we've made mistakes in the past. So there's a credibility issue, but I think right now what's really important as well is for the activist community right now here in 2021 to try again, to be open to that. And right now, we don't have that bridge builder in the community. I have yet to see that. Again, I've only been here for about a little more than a year now. And we have quote unquote leaders in these communities, but they're leading their own agendas. They're not bridge building. I don't know of anyone who's trying to bring the mainstream press together with the activist community. And this is really the first time a panel like this has really come to my attention. It's so valuable. And last point, let's be honest, the mainstream press is becoming more and more irrelevant. You have social media emerging. There are so many different publishing platforms. So we used to be the gatekeepers. You don't need to go through us anymore. That's my point.
Yeah, I think to the points everyone has made is in journalism, it often feels like there's not enough time to build in that trust building process with the people, with the communities that we're covering. And I think that that's a big problem. I think that we need to be working on building trust with these communities. And by building trust, what I mean isn't to just create an extractive relationship with the people we're interviewing, because journalism is inherently extractive. What I mean when I say trust building is talking to people when you don't need a story, when you're not on deadline, talking to community leaders who about what they see as valuable in their community, where they see issues, things that the media isn't covering, or the things that media is overly focusing on that may or may not be the larger issue at hand, or they're focusing on it in a way that's not actually representing the core of the problem of what's going right. I think we often, as the media, focus on when things are going wrong. And I understand why that happens, simply because we're running out of time, we're short-staffed. As newsrooms get smaller and smaller, I see this becoming more and more of a problem. But I think we really need to consider when and how we're reporting on communities of color, regardless of whether they're Asian American or not, is reporting on the joy in the community, reporting on the things that are hurting in the community, reporting on the things that matter to people in the community. As like in my newsroom, we're talking a lot of right now what it means to report for a community rather than reporting about a community. And I think that's something that is a lot of the time missing from media coverage. So I think the trust is really something that is missing. And working at The Stranger, I got to report on issues I really deeply cared about as an Asian American, as a woman of color. And I think that sometimes you get more access that way, because your identity is more represented in the groups that you're talking to. But I think on top of that, when you do have those identities that other people tend to trust more than, say, a white reporter, you have this extra layer of responsibility, I think, to make sure that you're accurately representing what people are telling you, because they have placed an extra layer of trust in you than they would to, say, one of my colleagues. So I think that's something we really need to keep in mind.
I wanted to add something. It's just like love dovetailing off you all. Anyways, I want to add something to that. This is one of the reasons I love the Emerald, and why I think community journalism is so powerful and can be experimental in ways that we maybe need for the future. So when I was a journalist, and I also would like want to report on people or communities that I really loved, I enjoyed doing that. I did a lot of profiles, but what I felt after a while was like, I'm still telling your story through my writing, and that can work. But there's also a way that I think a lot of community folks are like, I'm just really tired of other people talking for me or telling my story. So we at the Emerald also do a lot of like community invitations, and we just have people write their own, like their own op-eds, or, and we just try to take the time to really work with them, which I know traditional journalism doesn't really do that. There's the staff writers and that's it. You're not going to get a lot of contributions from other writers, but it's something to think about for the future of writing. Because as you point out, Jonathan, I think people are used to, like, they post really great stuff on social media all the time. I'm like, hey, you want to write this for the Emerald? Like, that was actually really well written, So I think people are kind of getting used to that also. Like, I know what it feels like to have a platform and say my piece, and, it's, why can't I do it, So
Sharon, it's the worst kept secret in the game. We rip off social media stories every freaking day now. We're mining social media websites, so 100%.
Well, so actually both Anna Sophia and Sharon, you started answering one of the questions in the Q&A box. So let me just bring that up here. So Tanya Wu asks, what do you believe is a way to build trust in the community between activists and journalists? So I'm wondering if maybe if some of the other folks would be interested in answering this question as well.
I can jump in on this one. I hate when journalists parachute in and something exciting or something scary or something traumatic happens, and all of a sudden there's a swarm of journalists and they're there for 5 minutes and then they're gone and you never see them again. That is not the way to foster that relationship and build that trust. Like Anna Sophia was saying, yes, you can go there. You could go there for a big story, but following those people on social media, engaging with them when you don't have to, saving their cell phone number, and sometime when you once in a blue moon have a day off from journalism, text them and say, do you want to go get coffee and talk about what's going on? And if they have an event that you're not assigned to go to it. Show up, have your face be seen there, because I'm not going to trust someone who only shows up when something bad happens and then leaves me high and dry. I want them to be there and be invested in my life and the things that I do, regardless of what's going on. And so I think we have to show up in many more ways, not when we just are assigned to, or not when we just know that that headline is going to garner attention, because that's not the way that's going to become a sustainable or equitable or healthy relationship. Because, like, again, Anna Sophia said, we're inherently extracting things from our sources because we're asking them to give their time and their emotional energy to share with us. And if we only show up when we want that and we want it to be taken, then that's just, it just is gross. Like, I don't know how else to put that, really. And so, in the last community I was in, I really made it a point with some of the sources I had who were involved in activism, where I got to know them over social media, and we texted and we called, and if they were having a community get together, I would ask permission first, but then I would show up, because I would much rather have them, see that I truly care than feel like, oh, here she is again to just take up my time and ask me more questions about my life that I don't owe her anything.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the op-ed thing, Sharon, with the Emerald, because I was invited to write my own story, when the Bellevue College thing happened. And I was like, what? I'm not a writer, I'm an artist. But I, talked to people and realized what the importance was of saying what happened in my own words. And I recognized that the power of that with, that provision that the Emerald has and the International Examiner, like, these are beloved community papers that I will trust. And there's a bunch of writers that go through there, but there's like a consistency with the access that the community has to tell our own stories. And, you know, that's just really important to me. And I know others in the community.
Just a few more points to help bridge maybe this actual divide or perceived divide. I think as journalists, but I think this is just basic common sense. I'm hoping that we can all challenge each other and ourselves to, you know, get out of our echo chambers, you know, and I know that we all have our own values and worldviews and our convictions, and that's great. God bless you. But, you know, for me, a litmus test is to go down my list of friends. Are all my friends Asians? Are all my friends whites? You know, how many black friends do I have? How many are LGBTQ? How many are Christian? How many are Jewish? I think we have to consider all of these different worldviews. And I think for me, that's how I form my stories. I think the problem is when you only hang out with your camp, people who agree with you, I think that's problematic, not just for our communities, but for democracy. You're not going to get the multiple facets. And especially in a place like Seattle, I've learned there's so many different perspectives, even within the Asian American community. Again, we love to say we're not a freaking monolith, right? So let's value that. Let's uplift those differences. And unfortunately, just in the past year, based on what I've seen, we've focused more on our differences than, you know, really bridging that and embracing all of those things and bringing it together. So I'd love to see leadership in that area.
We had another question come in, so I'm going to read that one as well. This is from Andrew Otanes. Thank you for your presence and candor here. For those of you who are in newsrooms, can you share if you think things are changing for the better on coverage of BIPOC communities? And if so, what processes have spurned that? And she's asking specifically, are things changing for the better in your newsrooms?
This is on the record, right?
We're being recorded.
Is this going to be broadcast though? Or can I put people on blast?
But yeah, you could send people to it. I think it's going to be posted on the ComLead website.
Well, I'll defer for now.
I think I can speak for my newsroom a little bit. I mean, my newsroom's gone through a lot of upheaval in the last 2 years since I've been at Crosscut, just in terms of staff changes and leadership changes. But this is something that we talk a lot about. Our staff is predominantly women and predominantly women of color, or it was for a time. And I think by having more diverse newsrooms, we're better able to have these conversations about, like, that headline doesn't read right. The way you're describing this person is racist. We're able to have those conversations and call in our colleagues to talk about how we can be doing better to serve our communities better. But in terms of better coverage of BIPOC communities, I want to be optimistic and say that we are doing better. I think in a lot of ways we are, as we talk about what our different approaches are to stories, talking about the stories that our audiences from diverse zip codes all over our state are curious about. I think that's something that we really try to consider as we're forming what to cover next about the upcoming elections, to talk next about, like, what the pandemic economic recovery looks like. I think I was reading something today, and it was one of the takeaways from the piece is that equity and justice have to be the first things you think about when you start into a conversation or you start your coverage. Randomly adding in random BIPOC people as experts in your stories, rather than bringing them in at the forefront, really ends up just tokenizing people, I feel like, in a lot of ways. And thinking of them as experts rather than, oh, I need to get a Black voice in this story, or I need to get a Latino voice in this story, I think would really serve us all a lot better, just to think about who are the experts in our communities and how can we reach out to them. And it also just normalizes having all people of color in news stories as not the face of a problem, but as a face of people who are experts on their communities, because we've been developing that expertise for generations throughout our lives. And I think that that's a way that we really need to be thinking about how we do our journalism, is thinking about who do we think are experts and interrogating why we think they are. and interrogating where stories come from. Again, are we writing stories for a community, or are we writing it about a community? I think one tends to be a little more extractive than the other. So I want to say that I think Crosscut is getting better. I hope I continue to push for that. I hope my colleagues continue to push for that. And I have to try to remain optimistic, even though I think that's really hard as a journalist a lot of times, that we are pushing that way. But I think ultimately it really comes down to hiring a diverse staff. I think having worked in predominantly white newsrooms for a lot of my career, a lot of story ideas that I would pitch or just other reporters of color would pitch would get shot down or pushed to the side or not spotlighted in the way that they deserved. And I think when you have more people of color in a newsroom, especially people of color in leadership, we're better able to see those stories and why they're important and valuable to our communities.
Follow up really quickly on, oh, I'm sorry, Sharon, please go ahead.
No, it's totally fine. I'm still forming my thoughts, so you should go.
I just wanted to echo everything that it's Anna? It's Anna, right? Or Anna?
Yeah.
Go by Anna.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's why I ask. For many of us, this is the first time we're meeting, right? So just due to COVID and just life. I echo, Anna, a lot of the things you're saying. And let me give you a perfect example of why diversity is important, but just because you hire people who look like us doesn't necessarily mean you're actually gonna get your stories on air about the community. So Como, I'm damn proud of our newsroom and our hiring managers. Our main anchor, Mary Nam, Korean American. Another anchor, Molly Shen, half Chinese, half white. Ryan Yamamoto, main morning male anchor. Then you've got Suzanne Phan, Vietnamese American, and you got me, Korean American, on the front lines. But guess what? We're not really doing a great job actually telling the stories in the Asian American community. So my point is, just because you have a byline with an Asian American person, or you have someone who looks Asian American on air, or you know, you hear them on the radio, that doesn't mean the stories in those Asian American communities are going to be told fairly and accurately. And that's where we need to get better. I'm talking about all the TV stations, at least in Seattle. We're just not doing a good job covering this unbelievably dynamic, rich Asian American community, you know, in Seattle. We're just dropping the ball there. So here's the key, though. Here's the point I was going to make. We need our viewers now then to chime in and say, we're watching you. We want stories about our community. That's not happening. So when my news director doesn't hear that from the audience, well, we're just going to stick to whatever else works for our ratings. And that is the challenge. So it's a two-way street. We need viewers, we need our audience, we need our readers to always chime in and engage. Does that make sense?
In terms of our newsrooms improving, I feel like I'm not in the best position to know that from a larger point of view, but because the Emerald was started specifically because South Enders in Seattle felt that they were being overlooked, and they were being and still are by the media in Seattle. And so our founder, Marcus Green, who's amazing, was like, you know, he's from the South End, was born and raised in the South End. This Black-led publication was like, hey, let's start our own media where we cover the stories that matter to us, that come from our community, that uplift our voices. So I feel like we were born out of that need for newsroom change. So it's been, I can't speak to like all publications, but what's been really cool about it is because that's what we were born of, seeing what's possible when you step outside of some of those traditional boxes. And the two of us working together have come up with some really cool ideas. So I do story auditing for us, which I understand is not super common in journalism, where I kind of look at all our content every month and I pull it together and I'm like, do a DEI analysis, like who are we representing, who are we not representing, where are our holes, what neighborhoods do we need to be covering, and where are we showing bias? And that like really helps us, because we are, you know, we're human beings. We bias towards what we know, right? As Jonathan was saying. So, you know, we'll notice like, oh, we're covering the neighborhoods that our staff live in. You know, like maybe we need to make an extra effort to like, you know, extend to South Park and White Center and places that aren't represented as much in our staff, right? So that's one of the things that we do a lot. And I think that's a big change. And then also, you know, just letting the community write their own pieces, I think is really interesting concept and maybe a little less seen. So I think those kinds of different processes can really shift journalism, maybe more the needle of it more towards where we would like to go.
Can I just say, Sharon, I think that is so cool that y'all do a DEI analysis on all of that. I mean, I have never heard of that being done, and maybe that's because I'm certainly not a higher up person at KNKX, so it's quite possible they're doing that. But I just have to chime in and say that this all sounds so awesome, and I think it's because it's Seattle that these efforts are being done. As someone who just came from working at a newspaper in rural Texas, I would literally have meetings where people would go like, all right, we need a Black story. It's like, we haven't done that in a while. So can somebody fish out? And, you know, I would try and step in and just like, you know, can we step back and see how wrong that sounds? You know, can we? And there was just, it was like trying to meet a really, really low quota. And that doesn't mean I don't have, it also meant that every story that they wanted to feature a person of color, and when I say they, it was the higher ups at my paper, they would come and ask me to do it because I was the only person in the newsroom and actually in the entire building who was not entirely white. So then I somehow had a better understanding of how that person's experience worked, which was just mind-boggling to me. But I'll just say it's very encouraging to hear this stuff, but I have to jump in with the caveat that it is really not like there in a lot of places. And I hope that that's a sea change is happening, but particularly at these smaller outlets or in places where people have a different political orientation, and like it can be pretty disheartening sometimes. But I think then the effort comes from the ground up, and we start implementing processes like that, and we recruit more diverse staff, and we make those changes. But in other parts of the country, it is a huge challenge.
I think what Sharon brought up about the DEI plan, which I agree, I think that's such a good idea. One of the organizations that my team, I work on our audience engagement team, that we all get like stars in our eyes when we think about them, is Oakland Side in Oakland, California. They actually just announced that they have like a community advisory board who reviews like 3 to 5 stories every month that they have published, and tells like the reporters, the editors, the higher ups, what was useful. Was this helpful to my community? Was this actually like for my community? Are we living up to the organization's values? Are we living up to like this reader focused mission that we are putting ourselves out for? And I think that is huge. And to answer Matt Chan's comment in there, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, for anyone who's not familiar. So DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. But I love that Oakland Side has this this high level of accountability from their community to come in and actually talk about the stories that they're reporting. And I think that's such a wonderful idea. And I love that more newsrooms are doing that to be more radically accountable to their communities.
I think that's a really cool idea, and I hope those people are getting paid.
Right? Oh my gosh.
I just, as a side note, I've been asked to be on many advisory, this and that and the other in my life, and it's like, and you know, it's like volunteer and all that. But I think that's a great idea, and it reminded me that at the Emerald we also have sensitivity readers who are community folks that we know and love, who have, you know, and we do compensate them. You know, who are like members of certain communities, like, okay, maybe we don't have right now on our internal team really strong Latino representation. So anytime we produce a story about the Latino community, we're going to have a sensitivity reader come in and double check us. And we've done that with Indigenous Pacific Islander stories too. And they caught a lot of stuff that we just didn't know, you know, like not using Okinas and Native Hawaiian language, you know, that kind of stuff. And we also have I think we could name it better, but it's like a cultural sensitivity, like fiscal calendar, where we keep track of like holidays and important events and things that matter to different communities, and make sure in advance that we're assigning stories, so that we're building from this base of like things that matter to community, and from the joy and the resilience you talked about, Anna, instead of only, like you said, Jonathan, leading with like, you know, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So we're really trying to balance out with joy and also resilience, and like just showing people like being amazing too, right? So
I noticed that several of you mentioned other kinds of stories that you'd like to see, sort of in general, like sort of in general terms. But I'd be interested to hear more from all of you, including Erin. What kinds of news stories would you like to see covered? Are there stories that you think are out there now that aren't being covered or need to be covered more? Kind of what would you like to see in news media in Seattle?
I can let someone go first. You know, I don't watch TV, so there's that. So let me mull on that one for a
It's all
minute.
going on social.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be on TV.
I think going back to what Sharon was saying, and sorry, hopefully I didn't interrupt you, Julia. I think going back to what Sharon was saying, again, it's reporting the stories of like when communities are doing well, which is often, communities are often doing well. They're surviving in ways that they're more than surviving, they're thriving in a lot of ways. And I think the fact that we're not covering that, especially when it does not pertain to a lead source in a story, or we're usually covering a community when something bad or sad or tragic is happening. We're doing a type of parachute journalism in our own way, even as local media, and I don't think that's okay. I think as talking about the things that are the brilliant ideas that are coming out of all kinds of different communities, talking about more than like bad graduation rates or bad test scores, talking about the things that schools in like underappreciated areas of our communities are doing well, or that are interesting or fun. I think talking about those stories is really important. And I think part of the reason we're lacking some of those stories is also a numbers problem in the newsroom of we don't have enough staff to cover those fun, heartwarming kinds of stories. But also because when it bleeds, it leads also applies to metrics online too, talking about the big, difficult stories, the sad things, the violent things. I think those do well and those perform well for companies who are very concerned about metrics, which is most media organizations. I think we end up tending to focus on things because we know those stories will get read by our readers. And I don't think that always comes from a place of like wanting to cover every traumatic event, because those kinds of stories take a toll on journalists too, in addition to the communities that they're covering and trying to build trust with. But I think it's one of those numbers problems, and I don't know how to solve it. I really wish I did. But I think doing some kind of self-assessment like what Sharon's talking about with diversity, equity, inclusion, but also looking at like what kind of stories are we telling about this community? Have we only told stories about like anti-Asian hate crimes in the ID? Like, are we telling stories about like how people are bouncing back, how shop owners are coming together, how artists are coming out in big ways for these communities? I think while it's obviously important to be talking about hate crimes, I think that that's really important. I think that that's something that people can also dwell on, including elders in our communities, thinking about like that's the only thing that's happening outside, and not wanting to interact with the community in a different way, in a way that they haven't been able to because of the pandemic. I think those kinds of news coverage can really continue building on the fear that has already been spreading because of what's been happening during the pandemic and what led up to it.
Yeah, just really quick, Anna Sophia, that just makes me think, I mean, we have the power, and I don't say this in a nice way here, we have the power to re-traumatize people and communities by continuously telling those stories. Or, you know, in the case of maybe a TV journalist, like showing that footage or something. And so by telling those, I mean, when I wrote down some notes, when I saw these questions, just the word that I wrote was joy, because that's just, I don't know, we can't, painting communities into corners of here's another bad thing that happened, or marginalized community continues to suffer. That can be not only re-traumatizing for that community, but it reinforces a narrative that particularly white readers, listeners, viewers may already have. And it can internalize a narrative that we may have or have been told about ourselves. And so I just want to, I'm headed into this new job next week, and that was my goal thinking about this question when I got it, is just stories about joy in our communities, because therein lies power.
Yeah, I guess thanks for the reminder of notes, Julia. The word that I wrote down was solidarity. These solidarity stories between communities, particularly communities of color, have traditionally been erased to make the white supremacist machine work, right? And we know that in Seattle, there are many of them, a lot of them around the formerly redlined neighborhoods where, my family and many Black families and other Asian families had to live. They had no choice. And so that, I think, would do a lot in kind of, ending this kind of false narrative that divides us. I would definitely like to see more of that, because people don't believe it, because it hasn't been told in the news.
Erin, I'm glad you brought that up, because I just wanted to emphasize again that this is a two-way street, right? Look, I can't speak for the way all your newsrooms work, but for the most part, many TV newsrooms, yes, you guys are white. They're led by white people. It's majority white, and they're using consultants, outside consultants, that tell them to shape and craft their rundowns in a certain way based on analysis or research groups that have been used in other markets. But again, what I'm learning and what I would love to see moving forward, a place like Seattle is for the Asian American community, the viewers, the readers, the listeners, especially, to understand and embrace how rich and diverse and how much power they have. Look, I feel bad for you, Julia. I know what New Hampshire's like. It's nothing like Seattle when it comes to the Asian American community. I don't even know if they have an H Mart. It's a good thing you got Boston. You can drive to Cambridge, Massachusetts or something like that near Harvard and MIT, because there's one right in the middle for all the Asian students. But, I'm just gonna be straight up. The viewers, the listeners, we can say right now on this call what we want and what we want to do as journalists, but it comes down to what the viewers, readers, listeners demand. You've got to hammer our newsroom managers and say, this is what we want. Unless they hear that, it's not going to happen. And you have someone like me, the only guy speaking up, trying to do that story about coalition building in the community. When you have guys like, former King County, I believe he was one of the commissioners, Mr. Larry Gossett? When he came out and spoke at one of the earlier rallies at Hinghey Park during the height of Asian hate, and he just owned it, because unfortunately the inconvenient truth was the images coming out at the time where, the perpetrators were Black on, these grandmas and grandpas. He didn't sugarcoat it. I have that recording. I put it on Twitter. He apologized on behalf of the Black community, but also said it's not all Black people. And that was so powerful. Those are the narratives that we need to tell. That's the type of stuff I want to emphasize, but we have to have our viewers, listeners, and readers demand that. Otherwise, we can't do it even if we want to. Guess why? Guess what? None of the people on this call, are any of us really managers or influencers in our newsrooms? We're basically, with all due respect, grunts. We're just the content creators, right? We go on the streets, we try to gather, do the interviews, tell the stories. We're not the ones saying, we're doing this, Cho. You know what I'm saying? So we need that. Getting back to your point, Anna, we need more newsroom leaders who are courageous, who are going to go tell these stories, but we need our freaking viewers, listeners, and readers to say, in Seattle, this is what we want or else. will the Asian community finally step up and start to flex and understand, according to the stats, the fastest growing minority group in the state, one of the most powerful political blocs? You got to start leveraging that in the media. Do you know how powerful storytelling is? Isn't that why we're in the business?
Jonathan, if I could just respond to one thing you said that I thought was interesting is, really demanding that our listeners, audiences, readers tell us what they want. While I think that's really important, my perspective would be to put a little bit more of the onus on us to say, we want to hear you, and we're asking you if you feel that you have the time and you have the space and you want to engage with us, we're going to start a social media campaign to ask for your response, or we're going to set up a table at your college campus and get our faces out there and ask for you to tell us what you want. Because I don't think we can necessarily expect people to come out and demand what they want. I think we have to be a part of that process because, like you said earlier, there are so many options for how we consume media that if I see something that rubs me the wrong way, I just never have to watch that channel again. And so,
that's great, Julia. Let's do that then. I'm not a newsroom leader, so I can't suddenly say we're going to go and just set up a table at a school and we're going to, or wherever, and invite. I mean, that's great. I would love to do that, Julia. But I have to now build credibility in my newsroom. And this is just general advice to young journalists who are primarily on this call, I think, right now here at University of Washington. I'm not a decision maker, but I can start to build that relationship with the decision makers in my newsroom and let them know these are the valuable things. You know what I'm saying? So there's a process, at least for me, Julia. If you can do that, by all means, I'll back you in New Hampshire. Let me know how.
Julia, I'd like to give you a chance to respond. And then after that, Sharon actually is a newsroom leader. So I'd like to hear from you too.
Not bad.
Oh, yeah, I know. I guess that's when it takes a little bit more work on our ends. Hopefully someday we can all be like Sharon in these positions of leadership in newsrooms and making those calls. But sometimes that's when it requires going back to your managing editor's office all the time and saying, like, hey, do you remember what I told you? I'd really like to go for that. Because sometimes that was the only way I got a story done in Texas, was by continuing to push and saying, I'm not gonna take no for an answer. But that being said, that's hard and it takes a lot of energy. So there are times when I decide it's too much and I don't really want to go there. But when we can, I think that's our responsibility to say, I'm not done here. And I'm gonna ask more of you.
I think I want to make sure I'm tracking the question. So we're talking about what we would like to see, right, in stories in the future. Okay, so a few things as I'm listening to you all. Thank you for this panel. I'm really learning a lot and thinking about a lot of things. What I would like to see is, now I'm spacing. Like, I actually got back from overseas a week ago, so my brain is half on and half off. But anyways, I'm going to start with Julia. I think being in a managing editor position, one thing that's really important to me is supporting our contributors and our writers. And especially when we're working with community folks and BIPOC folks and people with other multiple marginalized identities and marginalized identities, they sometimes need more support. And that is really important for shifting the way we tell news and stories, is that people in management need to just chill and like take the time to support us. And that's hard because I think that traditional news is like, go, 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 go. We're breaking. But without taking the time, then you're missing all of this opportunity. So like there are at the Emerald, we're different. We're not a breaking news publication specifically because our mission is to take the time to tell it right and not rush. And in that mission, there's maybe 3 assigning editors now at the Emerald. There's times where it like takes months for me to work very closely with a writer to just make sure they are putting their best work out there, but also they're being traumatized as they're doing it. So there's like a lot of, especially when like I assigned an API writer to write about like the fact that Filipino nurses were dying at a disproportionate rate from COVID, more than any other nurses in the US. And I assigned a Filipino writer for obvious reasons, but like I wanted to work really closely with that writer, make sure they felt supported. And I kept checking in and saying, this is really traumatic work. I understand, what do you need? And it took a while, but then we put out a really beautiful story, I thought. So that's one thing that I think is really important for management to do, it's like skill building that management, especially since you all are saying like management is predominantly white still in journalism. So we really need that from the top down. In terms of what I would like to see in stories, there are breaking news stories that we all are going to have to tell. You know, George Floyd, you know, there's a shooting again in South Seattle or whatever, but I think how we tell it is really important. So one of the problems I see a lot in journalism is there's like a framing by the writer that's really problematic, where it's like this person who did this shooting is a criminal, they're bad, you know, and that's like how we go in the gates. And so at the Emerald, we take a lot of time to be like, wait a second, if we're going to talk about another South End shooting, let's not talk about who's the criminal, who got arrested, what officer showed up, da 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 da. Let's talk about the community organizations that have been working forever to build grassroots solutions to this kind of violence that come from community itself. So we just try to shift the framing. I would like to see more of that. And then in terms of like what you said, Jonathan, about wishing that readers and viewers would tell us more what they're looking for, I would love that. I think that has to be a combination of us reaching out and maybe people feeling like they could trust us to give us that feedback. But I also feel maybe I'm off the mark here, that we're living in this really sensationalized culture that's gotten much worse with social media, where like clickbait and things that like hijack your amygdala are just what people go to. They're like sitting on the toilet, they're barely reading past the headline and like the header image. And that's like what we're all being conditioned to think is how we should get our news. I almost feel like we need to retrain ourselves to know what like is a valuable and personal and important story. And I'm not sure how to do that. You know, I know that the like trying to survive as media publications means like if the clickbait story gets all the hits, then that's what we're gonna do. And I'm like, that feels like a catch-22 somehow. Those are my thoughts.
So there's a question here that actually is tying together some of the things that several people were saying on the panel. So this is from Jay Dean, and they write, everything you've said has been truly helpful and insightful. I think I just want to relate to what Anna said about the type of stories journalists write. How do we combat the pain some stories bring from marginalized communities? And this was also reminding me of Erin, how you started us out when telling us about, you know, sort of the difficulty of telling some of these stories. And so I guess it's a question for all of you about, are there ways that you can think of maybe to try to minimize the amount of pain those stories bring, to make it maybe a safer space for people to be able to share those stories?
Yeah, I think to jump in, I was talking with my colleague about this because he and I kind of think similarly and differently about the role that journalism should be playing in our communities, especially when we're going through so much social and cultural change. There was something that I think I've read about it. It was basically, Will James from, I think, Northwest News Network and KNKX was talking about when we're thinking about how we're covering people who've lost people during the pandemic, talking about that death, talking about that loss, how can we as an industry try to minimize that? And one of the solutions he put forward is like, if we're thinking about like covering Seattle and talking to people who've lost family members, friends, loved ones, can we do our best to minimize how we're re-traumatizing that person or making them really feel their grief in an intense way that's weirdly public and is uncomfortable and embarrassing or makes them feel shameful? How can we try to minimize those feelings? And one of the ways that he said was like, can we just have like one person go in and talk to that person for this group of media? And that's a really non-traditional way to think about doing journalism. And I think we as an industry need to challenge ourselves better, more often, to do better by our communities going through these crises, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's violence, whether it's something else that's happening, whether it's natural disaster. Thinking about how we can put people through the least pain as possible while telling their story in a respectful and representative way that they feel like their story is being told accurately. And I love the idea of assigning one, maybe two reporters to help interview that person's family, and then share those stories with other members of media. but that runs completely counter to what our media culture is right now, which is everyone is trying to get the story first. Hopefully people are trying to tell the story better than it's been told before. But doing that requires dozens of interviews sometimes. And especially when it's a story about trauma or violence, like that's just, I can't imagine what it's like to be on the other side of that. Even in Erin's case, talking about like this day that is a holiday, but is also a time to remember pain one's community has gone through, and having to tell that story over and over and over again in different ways. I can't imagine how hard that is from the sources side, telling us about their pain, about what they've lost, about who they've lost, what they miss about that person, etc. Like, I think we as journalists need to learn, as an industry, we need to learn how to be more considerate of people having to process these things and allowing them time to like heal. And I feel like in a lot of cases, journalists reopen the wound a lot of the time, like, and that's part of how our job is to function. And I'd really like to see us as an industry move towards a place where we are able to take care of our community while still doing our job. And I think there are ways to do it. I think we just need to have a more national conversation about like what that looks like.
I would love to chime in with a couple thoughts here. I agree with you, Anna, and I was just thinking about, I've done interviews for journalism, but also for like book writing and research and just a lot of different kinds of interviews. And I think it could be really great for journalists to have like a standard, like a base of practice when you're going to go in and do an interview that could be re-traumatizing for someone, to like know how to set that interview up and check in with a respondent or an interviewee beforehand and say, what do you need? I know this is going to be really hard. And I want, and maybe they don't know that themselves. That does happen with folks of color sometimes. Like you don't realize till you're like talking about the racism you've gone through, like how much it hurts. So just also preparing them in case they don't already know, like this is probably going to feel really hard. Do you need someone there with you? Do you need resources? And then also checking up with them after the story has published. Because I think writers were like, done with the story, moving on, thanks, have a nice day. That can go really far. Just being like, hey, I want to check in, the story's out there, how you feeling, do you need anything? That could be amazing. Again, it's like a time issue. I know maybe the industry doesn't support writers putting that kind of care into a story, but it would be great.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think I'm the only TV guy here. And I can firmly say, and again, this is just my own personal opinion, does not represent any news organization I've ever worked at. But I think we have single-handedly perpetuated some of the worst stereotypes in the business, in our communities. Just because, again, television is such a powerful medium, right? You have images every single day. And look, I worked in Chicago as well. And I won't, without getting into all the details, I just remember cringing every single time. I was like, oh my gosh, it's another black guy involved in a crime. It's another black guy. It's another black guy. Over and over and over and over and over, we're reporting the same story with the same mugshot. Imagine what that does to the community, right? Not only traumatizing the black community, but then everyone else, like, black people are criminals. Wow, look at that. And my goodness, we just have not dealt with that properly. One of my buddies, who's in urban ministry in Chicago, he's like, Joe, is there any way for every negative story you do in the black community, you can do like 2 or 3 positives? I mean, that may seem so elementary and simple, yet I have yet to see any newsroom properly assess, like you, Sharon, right? Like to take the time to assess, like what's working, could we do this, and just go for it and try it. And again, I'm just thinking about pie in the sky, and I understand our news business is not just, you know, rainbows and unicorns, all right? That's just the reality. But man, that's something, especially for the future journos on this call. If you end up becoming newsroom leaders, I mean, consider that. Think about that, how powerful the image is and the narrative, and especially if you end up in television. But now everyone's doing video, right? We're all multimedia for whatever it's worth. Sharon, you're probably doing live hits for whoever. One day, Julia, your radio, you might be doing stuff for TV, blah, 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 Anna, you know, same thing. So, you know, I'm on all platforms. You know, at Como, we're not just TV, we've got a radio piece too. And then we have online, then we have Facebook Live. You know, you got to do it all now. So anyway, before I get off on a tangent, You know, that's just something that's always stuck with me. How can we do better representing certain communities by, you know, taking simple steps like that?
Did anyone else want to respond? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question here then. This is from Max, and I think it's from the activist point of view. If we as community members catch wind of a story angle that's inaccurate or potentially damaging, how do we communicate this to a reporting entity in a way that will be listened to? I think there is always the fear and lack of trust that these objections will be heard and respected, which is probably a reason why many of us prefer not to even open up that opportunity to begin with.
If I could take that really quick, that's a great question. But it, you know, for lack of a better example, it's like asking somebody on a date. You know, you want to ask that girl in the room on a date, but you're scared, you're not sure how she's going to react. You'll never know unless you ask. And I think my point is, you know, I don't know who this person is who asked that question, but give us a chance. Give us an opportunity before making a judgment or an assessment. You know, just ask and find out. We can have a conversation off the grid. An email or a phone call doesn't hurt. I would love that if we report a story. Like I said, I try to get multiple angles, but more than half the time, I can't get it. At least when I'm covering stories in the activist community, because again, as I said earlier today, guilt by association. Jonathan Cho works for Como News, so he may be completely against our agenda. I'm not like that. Give me a shot, give me an opportunity. Now, if I fail you multiple times, or even that one time, then fine, you have a case. But please don't cancel me until you've given me an opportunity. Does that make sense? Try, give us a chance first. That is what that's what's lacking, I feel like, in terms of this relationship that I've seen with the activist community and some of the mainstream journos in this town.
I think to what, oh, Erin, you go ahead. I want to hear your perspective first.
Okay. I'm very short-winded, as you've seen. So, well, you know, there's like a couple things that I've heard. I think they were like questions from you, Jonathan, where you were in the ID talking about trying to do a story about differences of opinion in the Asian American community about policing, you know, and you were framing it as the civil war in the community. And if that's the invitation, then there's going to be a reaction, you know? So maybe you could respond to that.
Well, first of all, that story hasn't aired yet. But again, in my opinion, based on what I'm seeing, when you have, at least based on my own analysis and my own research, I don't want to give away my story because I don't want to get scooped. And I'm not saying you're going to be doing the story yet, but Erin apparently somehow has some insight. I don't remember ever talking to you about that, but I'll answer that. What I'm seeing right now in the ID is that you have a vast majority of business owners and neighbors who live there demanding more police officers, just due to the rise in Asian hate and just the long history of Chinatown pretty much being like a dumping ground and not getting the attention that it deserves. And why do you think, as you know, people like Donnie Chin have had to, you know, step up to basically, you know, be a voice and a community patrol for the people who live there? So, you know, I wanted to find out exactly what was going on in the community, and what spurred it was what was brought up as an example earlier on this call, that some of the activists during a recent rally there not only asked journalists to leave, but asked the police to leave. And these Chinatown neighbors and business owners are like, how dare you? People who don't even live in the ID are speaking on our behalf and saying they don't want the police there, which also then goes back to the fact that the Asian American community, regardless of what your values are, it's a fact. Our voices have constantly been marginalized, stereotyped, or we haven't been heard at all. And so many Asian Americans I know right now, especially in the ID, are like, no, this is our time. We've had enough. So stop speaking on our behalf. We want to speak now. And I'm doing a story, and Erin gave a little preview, where basically I'm going to be talking to the neighbors and business owners in the community, but I'm also trying to talk to the activist community. You have groups like Densho, Japanese American Citizens League, ACRS, who have all doubled down after signing on to decriminalize Seattle. And that's basically an initiative that was started last summer at the height of the BLM movement to defund SPD, the Seattle Police Department, by 50%. But if you ask the business owners, the vast majority, how do I know? Because I literally went door to door. I did a survey of all in Little Saigon, Japantown, and Chinatown, who wants SPD? Every owner, nearly every owner. It's like, are you crazy? We need more patrols. Their criticism of the police was they wouldn't show up enough in Chinatown. And they're asking, would this happen in a more posh neighborhood in Seattle? But anyway, I don't know if I'm getting off on a tangent, Erin. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's a story that I'm working on, and I'm seeing just tension in the community. Oh, your question was about, well, if you frame it as though it's a civil war, the way I see it is I see Asian Americans as one. We're not a monolith, but we're a family. We have differences, different opinions and identities. But I believe, again, maybe growing up in Boston, whenever I saw an Asian person, I'm like, yo, bro, what's up? You're an Asian brother or Asian sister. And I'm bringing that here in Seattle and assuming, and I think I was wrong to assume that, but we actually are so different in many ways. So I can't assume that, but I came here and I simply posed that question like, look, aren't we family? Why is there like a civil war? Why can't we agree on how to best keep our community safe? So yes, from a sensational headline, Civil War in Chinatown's ID, if I actually publish that, then you have a case, Erin, but I haven't done that yet, in fairness. So until I do that, please reserve your judgment. But that's the story I'm getting at right now. And I think these types of stories that rarely get any play in mainstream newsrooms, I'm pushing that because I care about the community. And I know this is important in our Asian American community.
Okay, can I add something? So first, I wanted to go back to the original question. I can't speak to like what Crosscut's process or policies are, other publications, but at least at the Emerald, to the questioner's exact question, if you see something that you feel like we have done that misrepresented egregiously, or maybe even in a small way, your work or your activism or your movement, we have, a form on our site. You can write us right away, and we are on that fast. We don't have any problems changing a story, publishing a retraction. We've definitely, us assigning editors, we get together immediately. We don't wait on things like that. And stuff happens, everybody makes mistakes too, but we just try to make sure we're as responsive to community as possible and fix things right away. And it's definitely been like me, Marcus, like on the phone for hours. People are in tears, like trying to communicate why they're so frustrated, and just like really try to listen and make the changes. So we do that at the Emerald. And then I don't know about your story, Jonathan. I'm not sure what you're working on right now, but I would say, like a lot of communities of color have quote unquote in-group fighting that is a result of white supremacy. And this was the framing issue that I was talking about earlier, like all groups of color have in-group fighting, and it's usually because of something that white supremacy has engendered, some kind of competitive feeling or feeling that like is going to create resentment either within the group or with another group of color, which keeps us looking like we're fighting each other, and it keeps white people in power. And so that tension in Asian American communities between like maybe an immigrant or more conservative or older population that feels like policing is the solution, and then a maybe more radical or maybe younger, more left-leaning group that's like, no, we can't do that because that actually ends up hurting other communities of color more, is really a result of white supremacy, not really a result of Asian people not getting along with each other. And so I think it's important to remember to like have that large framework. I don't see that a lot in journalism. So I don't know if that's helpful.
That's like the third rail, Sharon, and I think that's a great point. I'm not necessarily saying I agree with your assessment, because I would like to know ultimately what white supremacy even means, how we're defining it for this conversation. Maybe that's another conversation for another day, because we can't assume, right, Sharon, that we define white supremacy in the exact same way and contextualize it the same way, you intend versus the way I'm interpreting it. But, I saw a question there right now, and I think goes back to Erin's initial question to me about the way I frame a story. Again, I haven't necessarily aired the story yet, so that's usually my baseline or standard, but I think it's a legitimate question by this person who asked right now on our text thread here. What about I guess the criticism from that, or Leilani, I think you have a question there, basically.
Yeah, because I think the question is less about your story itself than how you respond to criticism.
Exactly. So the criticism to that, and I'm sorry, I wanted to explain my story more, and I'm not trying to get defensive. I think, Erin, you 100%, I agree with the validity of your question. But I think context matters. My intent was to simply start a conversation. That's it, to see where it goes and whether or not others saw it that way as well. I'm not saying that's ultimately going to be the end result. I'm not even saying that's the right, accurate framing or characterization of actually what's happening on the ground. I want to be very careful. I wouldn't even go as far to say the community's divided, because it's not divided. I see divided as 50-50. It's not. So anyway, to answer that question, I think, as journalists, we have to take criticism. We have to be open to learning. And, communication isn't just speaking, right? It's listening. It's a two-way street. And we have to do a better job listening to people like Erin, and to really think and be thoughtful about, like, wait, what did she just say? And frankly, maybe some of the stuff she's, sharing with a lot of journalists, we're just not prepared to, process that or accept that reality. So, Erin and I, hopefully we have a relationship after this. I'd love to continue this conversation. And I'm hoping all journalists will, have the same posture that I want to have right now.
I think too, it's about, radical accountability, being accountable to the people you're writing stories for, and the communities that you're writing stories for. And it kind of goes back to Max's question of, like, if we know an angle, if you as a community member, as an activist, whatever, however you identify, know of a story that is probably going to come up, and you have some insight about other conversations that are happening that we as journalists might not hear, I think that it's really valuable to bring that to the table. And I think that there have been examples in the past, and even in newsrooms that I've worked in, where community members have come forward and where I've worked just push forward with the story anyway. And I think that that's wrong. I wanted to say clearly that I think that that's wrong to do, especially when it's something that can be so damaging. And I think as journalists, we're very open to having conversations. And I don't know if you, Max, are a journalist or not, but a lot of being a journalist too is having off the record conversations that aren't interviews, to say, like, tell me what's going on. What are the things that you're hearing, or what has your experience been like? And I think that, again, like, that kind of relationship building with communities should be so much of our job, is to be listening to people and taking in information and hearing people out when they have a different perspective on an issue that we might be writing about. I think doing that listening is a big part of our job, and I should be a bigger part of our job than we think it is sometimes.
So.
Is there no one else on the panel who wants to respond?
I guess I'll just say one quick thing. I think really echo what you were saying, Anna Sophia, that this concept of radical accountability means more work on our end that we need to do, where it doesn't just mean issuing a correction that, for say, I was in print for a while. Sometimes we would run corrections that are about this big in the bottom corner of the newspaper. So sorry, we spelled someone's name wrong in Sunday's edition. And that's all they got. And that to me is pretty lazy, especially when that mistake, particularly, I think someone's name is so crucial, like, especially in, like, my name gets misspelled all the time, and it's really frustrating because I know it's a lack of care on that person's end. And so I think for news organizations, that means, not just like putting those things at the forefront and putting that out on your social media and saying, hey, we effed up, and here is what we're going to do. Here's the steps we're going to take to rectify that. We, at my past newspaper, as many problems as it did have, you know, there was a story that one of our reporters wrote that really inaccurately framed a person, got their story wrong. And we decided to have her, with that person's consent, re-interview them, redo the story, and we reprinted it as a center feature for our Sunday paper with an editor's note that said, here's us trying to do better because we didn't do well. And so I think it takes that type of radical effort where you say, you know what, screw it. We're gonna go out there, say we did wrong, and we're gonna do you one better. It really takes that type of legwork for it.
I think too, it's remembering a lot of the time that journalists and I think activists have a lot of the same goals of wanting to make sure we're telling stories accurately and that we're providing context for things that are being said. I think that we have very much overlapping goals, and activists are very loyal to their communities, care very deeply about our communities. I would say that journalists should be feeling that way too, that we should be caring deeply about the communities that we're reporting on. And I think, especially with how the pandemic has really showed how crucial accurate information is, I think that we do need to be showing that we can be trustworthy, showing that we do care deeply about these communities and that we are accountable to them, bringing them into our process when it's appropriate, when we're asked to, showing them how we do our jobs, how we approach the work that we're doing. I think that that's something that lots of newsrooms can be doing. And it's not just teaching students how journalism works and doing a career day kind of thing. I think it's walking through people like, here's how I approach a story, and like even having that kind of offline conversation about like, this is how I think about my job and how I get started doing it. Here's how I start writing a story. I think that I talk a lot about my newsroom about digital literacy and understanding the ways in which media gets made and why it gets made and how it gets made. I think that that's a really important thing for our community to see, our communities plural, to see, especially as mistrust in media grows deeper because of the political environment we're in and so many other reasons and histories of misrepresenting people. I think that that's something that we really need to try to heal some of those wounds by bringing people into the process and showing that we're like human people making these, doing the storytelling, telling these stories, and working with communities to try to show what they're doing, to highlight the things that they're going through, good or bad. I think that that's a big area of responsibility we have in such a digital environment nowadays too.
Oh dear, there's more questions, but unfortunately we're getting close to the end of our time, and I would love to leave a few minutes at the end and for you all to maybe give us a couple concluding ideas, maybe things that you would like to either to wrap up or things that you'd like to leave us to think about. And so maybe we'll go in reverse order from the last time. I think, did we end with you, Sharon, last time?
Oh, sure, I can start. I don't want to like make a big grand speech. I'm just
no, you don't have to.
I have very simple thoughts. I'm very grateful for this panel. I learned a lot and I'm thinking about a lot of things, and it's exciting to be like, okay, because media is tiring, let's just be real. It can be, it's exhausting trying to be like, what story are we trying to tell? Are we telling it well? And I feel like some energy now around like, oh, there's some new stuff we could try and some things I want to look at, and that's all thanks to you all in this conversation. So thank you for that. And then closing thoughts. As I was listening to this conversation, I was like, wow, media really is just changing, whether we like it or not. Like what we think of as media. Jonathan or John, do you prefer? I'm not sure.
I go by Jonathan, but call me whatever you want.
Jonathan, yeah, you made this point several times. It's like media is changing so much, and what the near and far future of it is going to be is interesting. I was listening to a group of younger folks recently talking about television, and there was a teacher and leading a conversation, and she said, "Who watches TV?" And everyone was like, it was like a room of like 20 people who weren't, I mean, they were young to me, but they were probably in their like late 20s or 30s. And I was like, what? None of you watch TV? And they're like, I mean, I watch my phone. I watch the news on my phone, but like, we have a TV, no one watches it. And I was like, whoa. I mean, that compared to my son who's 11 and the way he interacts with media is really interesting to think about how we can take conversations like these and translate them into the future of what media is going to look like. And I don't know what that is, but it's exciting, I think. I think there's a lot of possibility. I'm going to end on a high note.
Jonathan?
Oh man, I was just gonna say I don't want to end on a low note or a negative note, but I just want to get real right now. Yeah, thank you again. This panel was incredible. I look forward to grabbing a coffee with all of you at some point. Hopefully before you leave, Julia. I got to give you a heads up on New Hampshire, different world. And for others, I'm primarily on Twitter, so you hit me up anytime. DM me at Choshow, CHOESHOW. So I'd love to connect with all the viewers, listeners on this Zoom call. And I'd be happy to spend time answering questions and even sitting down because I have my COVID double shot now, so I'm all good and ready to go. But I think I was asked to be a part of this panel because, again, the premise was, why can't the activists get along with mainstream media? What's going on? And, I think just the one thing that I wanted to say regarding where I stand and kind of what's just bothered me up to this point is when you have activists telling me that I can't tell certain stories or ask certain questions about my community. And I think what's really bothered me is I've had some activists and even some activist journalists tell me I can't talk about, again, the inconvenient truth that, we see a lot of these Asian hate crimes and harassment, and the images are of Black people, okay, attacking Asian people. So instead of saying, why don't you try to make sense of that? What's gone on in that community? Why does this keep on happening? Instead of saying add context, add perspective, we need that. Does the 90s LA riots with Rodney King where the Koreans were targeted and that history have anything to do with this? And I mean, there's so many different narratives that need to be told, but instead I'm being told, don't talk about it. It perpetuates negative stereotypes. Just talk about the positive stuff. And I think that's what really bothers me as a journalist. That's a big pet peeve of mine when I'm basically being told to shut up and they want to muzzle me because they think that my narrative or that questioning is going to undermine the activist agenda. That's fair. That's fair. But with that said, I want to end on this. I am hoping, though, and based on what I'm hearing on this panel, despite our differences, we have a lot more things in common. And one is we all care about Seattle, right? And I think it is in our best interest to really get together like this again at the table and maybe identify the stakeholders in the activist community. Because frankly, I don't even know, as we saw with the BLM movement, there is no one leader, right? I mean, that was intentional. You have a bunch of leaders. When one, goes down, 10 more sprout up. And I think that's really fascinating with the activist community, the Asian American community. There's no leader who I can go to right now. So I'd love to identify, different leaders, different voices, and start bridge building. Because I have yet to see that. All I've seen is you're canceled. You work for this group. I'm not talking to you. I'm like, what? Is this for real? So I hope that this panel is the beginning of breaking that cycle that I feel like we're in. That's it for me.
Erin?
Not much to add. Thanks everybody for your time. This is, new territory for me, so I look forward to having more conversations. Thanks everyone.
Sophia?
Yeah, thank you again to everyone here. It's nice to see some familiar faces and to meet some new ones and hear everyone's perspectives. My hope, from talking about these things and talking about these things more openly is to build a better media industry. I think that's something that all of us need to work towards. And when I mean better, I mean, again, being accountable, taking time to listen to our communities, considering who who's missing in our leadership, whose voices are missing at the top, and whose voices are missing telling these stories that are so important to all of us. I really hope that that's something that we as an industry work on and continue working on, and that we consider how we want to tell these stories in meaningful ways that are, again, for communities and not about them. I think being involved in these communities that we're covering is really important, not just to us as journalists, but to us as people. And I think a lot of times journalists forget to be people before they're journalists. And I completely get how that's hard. But my hope in a conversation with journalists and talking with activists is that we can together build a media industry that is accountable, that is truthful, that is telling vibrant, important stories, and that we can take time to reflect on what we're doing. I think that's something that's missing a lot of the time, is taking the time to think about how we're doing and give ourselves kind of a report card. I think that that's really important to do. So thank you, everyone.
Julia.
Yeah, I guess I just want to thank everyone for letting me be a part of this. I'm just about, actually, I saw one of my college professors on this panel. I just graduated a little over a year ago. And so thank you. I'm very new to all of this, and hearing all of your wisdom and hearing from you, Erin, too, just, it's really helpful for someone who's just starting out to see that there's other folks out there who are really trying to make this radical change that I'd like to see happen. So thank you for being those people. And like Anna Sophia said, I hope that we can work together to become as accountable and as authentic and use our power in the best way possible that doesn't serve our own agenda, but is really for the people who read, listen, or watch us.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone. This I feel like I've been on a roller coaster ride for the past hour and a half. So thank you. I feel this like you do, Sharon, very sort of energized, so many new ideas kind of swirling around. And I want to thank you all for participating, especially Erin and Sharon is maybe wearing your activist hat. I know it's not that easy to be the one who maybe can, well, maybe tells us some of those inconvenient truths. So thank you all for participating and, you know, being willing to put yourself out there and be honest in your opinions. So it was great talking to you all. This has been filmed. It's going to be up on the website for ComLead. It probably takes a few days to do that. And I just want to thank everybody for coming here and participating.
Thank you.